Hello and welcome to the Friday, April 15th, 2022 traditional tax day edition of On Iowa Politics. Support provided by New Pioneer Co-op, celebrating 50 years as Eastern Iowa's source for locally and responsibly sourced groceries with stores in Iowa City, Coralville, and Cedar Rapids, and online through Co-op Cart at newpi.coop. This week, a presidential visit, ESA opposition, infanticide, and a lingering ballot question. Hi, I'm James Lynch of the Cedar Rapids Gazette, and with me today are Sarah Watson of the Quad City Times. Good morning, Sarah.
Good morning.
Jared McNett of the Sioux City Journal. Good morning, Jared.
We got to make this quick, James. We've got to fill up barrels with E15 and then try to make some sales.
Erin Murphy, Statehouse Bureau Chief for the Gazette. Good morning, Erin.
Good morning, James, and that is also distilled grain dust on my jacket, not bird poop.
Sure. And Gazette Opinion Editor Todd Dorman. Good morning, Todd.
Good morning.
Todd is drinking shots of ethanol as we speak.
Yes, aged 4 years in bourbon barrels.
First up, the presidential visit. President Joe Biden returned to Iowa for the first time since shortly before the November 2020 election. If he had stuck around longer this week, he could have enjoyed tornado season, but he lifted off before the Twisters touched down in Iowa. He was here long enough to announce ethanol will be available to everyone all of the time. That's right, year-round sales of E15 everywhere. Erin, you waited in the wind and rain to see the president. His announcement was not a surprise to anyone who's been paying attention. He seems to be taking his cues from the corn growers and ethanol producers, announcing E15 could be sold throughout the summer as a way to provide some relief to consumers and maintain an adequate fuel supply through the summer driving season. He got some props even from Republicans, although they said his temporary measure doesn't go far enough. I'm not sure if an April visit can be considered a campaign appearance, but did his visit and announcement do anything to improve his stance this year?
I mean, that's asking a lot. That's a heavy lift for a fly-in to talk about gas for a half hour. I mean, at the very least, I think what was maybe most interesting politically about it was how it's all tied to Cindy Axne and her prospects in the 3rd District specifically. That's where the event was held. She was there, fully embraced the president's visit. He talked about her in his remarks right off the bat and talked about how great she is. So I think if you're looking for a political impact, it's there. Now, does that help or hurt her in that district? That's a Trump-carried district in 2020. Cindy Axne is one of the few remaining Democratic Congress folk in a Trump district. I think clearly what the political calculation there is that it's the policy that they can lean into, that Cindy actually can lean into. She can talk about the infrastructure bill, and she can talk about ethanol being made available year round, which in Iowa is a big deal, and a popular idea. So is it going to help whoever goes against Chuck Grassley? Is it going to help Deidre DeGier? Probably not. Maybe help Cindy Axne a little bit in that she can say, hey, this policy that Iowans like is something that I leaned into.
Yeah. She was the only Democrat there. The only candidate. We didn't see DeGier or Liz Mathis or Christina Bohannon or anybody up there with the president.
Yeah, that's correct. And there was another like a meet and greet line, I believe, out at the airport where the president met some Democratic lawmakers. But even among those, it was like current members of the legislature. It wasn't Christina Bohannon or Liz Mathis would have been a current one. And now I'm kicking myself. I'm going to look that up. I can't remember if she was on that list or not. I'll look it up and jump back in the middle of someone else's remarks here later in the
podcast. At one point, Biden said, quote, "This is an industry with a tremendous future. You simply can't get to net zero by 2050 without biofuels." Todd, it might be considered heresy in Iowa, but there are economists and environmentalists who would disagree. Will the president's E15 endorsement provide fuel to the arguments for ethanol mandates and carbon capture pipelines?
Liz Mathis was not there either. There you
go. How dare you?
I promised I would. That now I'm done. Sorry, Todd.
No, that's okay. Yeah, there are environmentally minded folks who look at the pipeline projects. Those are gonna be needing multi-billion-dollar federal tax credits, and they question whether the climate fighting value of the pipelines is really worth all that money, and whether would it be spent better doing something else. We've given ethanol a lot of government support over the years. This is the Biden stop was, how many times have we had presidents and candidates of both parties come to give similar praise for ethanol over the last 40 years, and it's still not able to stand on its own feet economically without that mandated markets and tax credits and all of these things that make it more viable. So there is that economic argument. I mean, is this really the future of American energy, or are we just sort of propping up something that if we were to stop propping it up, it would collapse under its own weight? And with the pipelines, I mean, this has put a new dimension on the issue. I mean, those pipelines are going to pump carbon from ethanol plants, and really it's sort of a very expensive, marketing campaign so that they can basically say, look, ethanol is greener now. We're not producing as much carbon. Our footprint is smaller. But in order to do that, you got to take people's land, which is not sitting well. And the opposition to the eminent domain issue on these pipelines is being, in some cases, led by Republican farmers, Republican local boards of supervisors, and so and then the legislature, the Republican-controlled legislature hasn't seemed to have much appetite for stopping the use of eminent domain for these pipelines. It looks like even the proposal for a moratorium isn't a done deal yet, and may not be. So yeah, the ethanol politics is more complicated now than it maybe has been in the past when presidents sort of pledged allegiance to corn. But I would have liked to have heard more from the president on his views on the future of energy rather than sort of another pep rally for biofuels.
Todd, they have to pledge allegiance to corn, and then they have to forge like a Wicker Man-esque effigy and like burn the effigy and then dance around it. That's what they have to do when they come.
Yeah, maybe they have to build like a corn palace or something. So
yes,
roasted corn. Okay.
Well, George W. Bush, he just grabbed an ear of raw sweet corn and just started chomping on it. That's how much he loves corn.
Yeah. It's interesting that Summit Carbon Solutions published a poll they had done this week. It's by wide margins. Iowans believe the ethanol industry is important for the farmers and the state's ag industry, the state's economy. It's good for the environment and has a positive impact on the state of Iowa. So I guess the president must have seen that poll and decided to come to Iowa and talk up ethanol.
I'm really surprised the Summit poll showed wide support for ethanol. That's that's remarkable. Is there anything that ethanol can't do? I guess is the
It's good for everything. It's like those ads at the bottom of your webpage, vinegar, a million uses, or try this.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Moving right along here, let's do a legislative update. Governor Kim Reynolds scored a significant political victory during the current legislative session with passage of her tax cuts. However, another priority, educational savings accounts, is proving elusive once again. Sarah, her problem seems to be that too many Republicans oppose the voucher-like plan that would provide financial assistance to students attending non-public schools, and they weren't bashful about voicing their opposition at a forum you covered.
Yeah, so Gary Moore, the chair of the Budget Writing House Appropriations Committee, he represents Bettendorf, and the bill's actually in his committee, and he wasn't shy about saying, and he I think has said at previous forums too, that he doesn't disagree with the idea of school choice and giving money to parents and families who want to choose private schools. But the sticking point for him was some of the money that would have gone to public schools if somebody switched. Part of it would go to the private school and part of it would go to a rural district out in Iowa, not in his legislative district. And he just said he couldn't support that. And then Ross Postgen, he's not running for re-election this year, but he said in previous years as well that he represents Walcott, which is a more rural area of the Quad Cities, and he's said too that he doesn't support the premise of school vouchers or school educational savings accounts, as they're dubbed. So yeah, and they really. It seems like Gary Moore is maybe among the Republicans that may be willing to broker some kind of compromise, but we'll just see how many Republicans can get on board with that.
Yeah, and Erin, you've been following this too. This is an issue that they couldn't get across the finish line last year. Now the Senate has approved the governor's plan, but it's just sitting in the House. Any idea on what the prospects are?
I mean, it still sounds like an uphill climb based on everything that we're hearing. And I think the way that if it gets done, it's not going to be because Republicans change their vote on this. I think for the most part, everybody is where they are on this topic. There's nobody that's still waiting to get more information or learn something that they don't yet know. I think the only way it happens is if it is involved in some horse trading and the so-called grand bargain that ends the legislative session, where if someone can, to Sarah's point, if there's someone like Representative Moore and a few others like him who are against it now but could be persuaded and say, if you give us a vote on this K-12 vouchers bill, then we'll give you a vote on XYZ, any of the other number of bills that are out there right now, to get them both across the finish line and get us out of here. I think that's the only way that this bill passes this session, because on its own, there's pretty clearly not enough support for it. And I don't even know if that's going to happen. It was interesting when we asked the governor, I'm going to take credit for this. I did it. When I asked the governor about this this week.
My exclusive interview.
That's right. She, for the first time that I can remember anyways, and I asked some of our colleagues here and they couldn't remember it either. For the first time this year, she kind of phrased her answer through, and if it doesn't get done this year, I'll come back again next year and try again. That's the first time she's really put it in those terms, which I felt was somewhat noteworthy, that she's maybe getting to that point where she's seeing the writing on the wall, and maybe it's not going to get done again, and it's going to have to be. And look, there's some reasoning to that too. We've got an election this November. A number of the no votes in the House are people who are retiring. There are some Republican primaries in the state legislature, so maybe the group that comes back next year is a little different and a little closer, and they can get it done next year. So there's some sound logic to that if that's the case too.
Well, and I guess if she gets reelected, which looks likely, she can claim this as part of the mandate that voters gave her, that they want this.
That's a really good point.
Although nobody really seems to be talking about it that much. At least I'm not hearing people talk about it. I mean, it doesn't seem to be the issue that is attracting attention.
And it's not a majority supported issue. We saw that in the recent batch of Des Moines Register Iowa polling. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it was an underwater situation for the idea of this type of a program.
Yeah. It almost strikes me as it's one of those things that it has too many moving parts, and people are skeptical that it's going to work. They may agree with the philosophy, but they're not sure that it's going to work because
and again, back to Sarah's point, who I think I can't remember which lawmaker over there who said it, but when they added the piece of, okay, because the big concern last year was for rural schools, what's going to happen if a bunch of kids leave a rural school? So they added the piece this year to try and get those votes where, okay, we'll send some money from each of these students that moves to rural schools. Well, great, but now that lost you other votes for the legislative Republicans in the urban districts who said, hey, you're asking me to sign off on sending money away from my school to someone else's. So that's a great point, James. There's so many moving parts. You pick up a vote here, but you lose one over here.
Well, and I don't remember the number, but isn't it something like the money goes to the 100 smallest schools?
Something along those lines.
And the 101st and the 102nd smallest schools are saying, like, well, what about us? Which
right.
seems pretty obvious reaction when you set an arbitrary limit like that. So anything else going on in the legislature, Erin?
Not at all. We're at I like to call this the white smoke point of the session. We're all just sitting around waiting for the white smoke to come out of the chimney to tell us that we have not a new pope, but a grand bargain deal on these last bills. We're literally at the point where nobody's at the Capitol. The rank and file have all been sitting home. It's the Jack Whitford, Pat Grassley, and Kim Reynolds show right now, and we'll know something when they tell us.
One thing I heard this week that I found interesting, and I should have mentioned this earlier when we were talking about ethanol, is that the governor seemed to be saying that perhaps Biden's visit might help her get her ethanol mandate, not a mandate, passed. It's I think the House has passed it, and now that's in the Senate.
That's correct.
Waiting for action, and this would require fuel stations to like sell ethanol in half their pumps. I think there are a bunch of waivers to make it more palatable, but the governor seemed to be hoping that Joe Biden could help her get her legislative agenda passed.
Politics and strange bedfellows, right?
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, and I mean, there's some. Well, first of all, you're right. The House passed it. It was literally the first bill they passed, so that's how long it's been sitting in the Senate. There's, in a vacuum, logic to that, what the governor's saying, because maybe there was hesitance out there that, well, you're going to mandate that we sell E15, and for 3 months out of the year, whatever it is, we can't sell it. So you're mandating us to sell something we can't sell. So this, new provision would seemingly address that concern. That said, that's not why the bill's stalled. So it sounds good, but it's maybe a little more hopeful or optimistic than what's actually grounded in reality here.
Wow. That's unusual in politics, isn't it?
Yeah, right. Who knew?
Speaking of that, exaggerated and unsubstantiated claims are not unusual in political campaigns, but Jared, Sioux City lawmaker Jim Carlin, who wants to jump from the Iowa Senate to the big Senate, made one that caught your attention the other day. According to Carlin, they're legalizing infanticide. And we're talking about Jim Carlin, who is challenging Senator Chuck Grassley for the Republican nomination for the Senate this year. What's he talking about?
The answer to that one is I'm not sure at all. He made those remarks at a GOP Meet the Candidate type event in Mason City, which the Globe Gazette first covered. And there wasn't really a citation of what it was specifically he was talking about. And when I was doing my follow-up reporting, I noted that the only recent federal bill even dealing with abortion, which is not infanticide, that bill was defeated in the Senate in February because of Joe Manchin, who's a Democrat. So if there's a sweeping campaign right now to kill kids up to 28 weeks after they're born, the campaign isn't going very well. It's off to a shaky start in the halls of Congress.
Carlin isn't seen as likely to defeat Chuck Grassley in the primary. Is this his attempt to lock down the My Pillow guy vote?
Well, it's funny you would specifically mention the My Pillow guy because at the event where Carlin talked about infanticide, the guest speaker was Tamara Scott, who's the national committee woman for the Republican Party of Iowa, and hosts a show on Mike Lindell's TV network. And of course, Mike Lindell, among other things, has promoted oleander as a cure for COVID. And he just so happened to have a stake in a pharmaceutical company that was developing an oleander product for COVID. Small coincidence there.
What a happy coincidence.
And then, of course, Mike Lindell's also been sued for saying that, Dominion Voting Systems rigged the election. He's getting sued for $1.3 billion for that. So, yeah, all of that to say, I guess, that talking about this kind of stuff is, I guess, a way to differentiate yourself from someone like Grassley, who is about as mainstream of a Republican as you could get, at least in Iowa, just by fact of how long he's been around and everything like that. So when you're running against a candidate who is in his, seventh term now, you kind of have to track further to one side or the other to even try to get noticed.
As long as he's been around, I think Chuck Grassley probably, built the mainstream. of the. Well, we didn't have a mainstream when I started.
That was in the first infrastructure bill.
Yeah. Back when we were nonpartisan. Moving along here. The Iowa Supreme Court heard arguments this week in the challenge to Abby Finkenauer's place on the June 7th Democratic ballot. Like county auditors with primary election ballots to print, Erin is feverishly hitting the refresh button on the court website to see if a decision has been rendered. I don't believe there's anything yet this morning. There's stiff competition from a presidential visit, the strong possibility Iowa Democrats won't be first in the nation in 2024. But is Finkenauer losing her spot on the ballot the biggest political news story of the week, Todd?
Oh, I think it's a very big story. Obviously, I mean, she's the person that's expected to win the Democratic primary for U.S. Senate. So, obviously, not having the signature dispute is a big deal. And if she's knocked off the ballot, then that shakes things up considerably. And suddenly you have Mike Franken, perhaps, I guess, becoming the new leading candidate for the Senate. And there are debates within the Democratic Party whether that's a good thing or whether if Finkenauer's knocked off the ballot, that's the end of their chances. So, yeah, I mean, it's a very big story, and there'll be a lot of nervous waiting on the Finkenauer camp for the Supreme Court ruling to come down. And, looking at the oral arguments and some of the questions that were asked and answered by lawyers on both sides, it's really hard to tell which way they'll go. I would, it looks like something that's going to be 4-3 one way or the other. So it's going to be a difficult wait for Abby Finkenauer, and hopefully, does anyone know when have they said?
No, I in fact just so for the benefit of the listeners, we tape on Friday morning. It's about 10 a.m. Friday as I say these words, and I had just checked in with the court's comms person, and no estimate was given. I think the general feeling is maybe Friday, more likely some point over the weekend, Monday morning at the absolute latest. So depending on when you're listening to this podcast, that ruling may already be out. And I was going to add, Todd, to your point, I followed, I had other things going on, so I wasn't at the hearing, but I followed them on YouTube just because it's fascinating stuff. But I asked Stephen and Gruber Miller for the Des Moines Register, who was there, and he said he talked to 3 lawyers afterwards to ask them if they had a sense for how this would go, and he said he got 3 different answers essentially. So if it makes if anybody out there doesn't have a good sense for which way that's going to go, you're in good company.
At least everyone can learn a good lesson. Like, if you don't turn your petitions in a week ahead of the deadline when you've barely got enough to qualify. I think that's it's a cautionary tale, but it seems like we just keep having cautionary tales and no one ever gets cautious. So what good are they?
Well, assuming the worst for Abby Finkenauer here, if she isn't on the ballot, what are her options? Does she do a sort of a David Young and run for the Iowa legislature again? Start Hinson Finkenauer rematch for 2024, or launch the Finkenauer Ernst 2026 campaign?
I'll tell you the other interesting possibility that's out there, and I think this is only possible because it's still the primary. You couldn't pull this off if it was the general, and even in the primary, it'd be a tall lift. But because it's a lower voting event, maybe it's possible. Does she mount a write-in campaign? I mean, that would be interesting. I don't like I said, only because it's a primary is that possible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's going to be a long process for Alan Osterkin to go to every county and make sure her name is spelled right.
And that's thank you. I had that exact same thought as like, so if she does that, we're having this legal battle all the way to the Supreme Court over an address and a date. Can you imagine the legal battles over whether Abby Finkenauer's name was written correctly on thousands and thousands of write-in ballots. Oh my God.
And if people write Abby, is that enough?
Right. Or if they write Abby F, does that count? And oh God.
Well,
Yeah.
So
and the
I hope
Republicans
she doesn't for that reason alone.
We'll then find out from Republicans exactly how many Abbeys there are living in Iowa. Because
Yeah.
it could be any of them. You don't know.
Don't know.
Maybe she'll run to court quick and change her last name to Smith. That would,
And
we'll
learn what's the definition of name in Iowa code. You know,
Yes.
what is a name?
Oh
man.
my! Well,
I-
it'll keep the attorneys busy.
I'm of a couple of minds about some of this Finkenauer stuff from this week. Like, obviously, as Todd talked about, this is what happens when you barely clear a threshold for certain places. These challenges can become a lot more real. Something I was a little bit admittedly confused by, though, was some of the backlash to Finkenauer calling the judge like a partisan judge. I get specifically why Republicans would make hay over that. Like, that's what you do, when your opponent says something that's headline grabbing. But I was a little more confused by the backlash from some Democrats, because wouldn't you want your candidates fighting back as much as possible from any of these kind of challenges to like your campaign and all of that stuff? Or is that maybe a little too fiery for them?
I wonder, that's a good question. And I wonder if the only thing I can think to that, is there any residual from the Democratic Party of like, hey, we've been giving former President Trump and all his supporters heck for years now for trying to overturn an election and trying to use the courts to do that. And would we look hypocritical if we supported Abby Finkenauer, taking, it's not the same, it's not apples to apples, but it's at least in that universe, I guess. It's an interesting and fair question, I think you ask, and I'm just kind of trying to get into the mind of Iowa Democrats and guess why some might be hesitant.
The other factor might be that Democrats really led the charge in 2010 against Republican attempts to kick 3 Supreme Court justices off the ballot, and the battle cry then was, you're politicizing the courts. Judges are trying to do their job, and you're injecting politics into all of this. And so I think there are people that went through that are like, yeah, let's not start, and also in this case, I mean, it's such a close call with decent arguments on both sides. I'm not sure his partisan background was really the deciding factor, although he was the same judge in the Northeast Iowa Legislative District. Right. And I think that kind of added fuel to the fire of people thinking, hey, what's going on here? He doesn't. I
think that's exactly right, Todd. I think that made him vulnerable to that line of attack, but I would agree that if you set that aside and look at the actual merits on this case, there's reasonable arguments to be made on this, and that's why it's landed at the Iowa Supreme Court's feet.
Well, and I also wonder too, if Democrats, the only power really that the judges have is the power of public opinion. And so, if in the future there's a question about a Republican nominee to the ballot, if Democrats are going to say, if voters are going to remember, oh, hey, Democrats called this judge partisan, but now he's ruled in your favor. Like, what do you think now? So, that's just maintaining that trust in the courts if they rule however they rule.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
I also wonder too what if she does get on the ballot. I feel like the Republicans are going to just attack her so much for this. Like, she's illegitimate on the ballot. I could just see the press releases all the time now.
Yeah, they're not going to let her forget about it. They're not going to let voters forget about that. She barely did enough to get on the ballot, and what is she going to do if she gets to Washington? I mean, is she going to do barely enough? And I mean, you can just imagine attacks on her. So, as we mentioned, another political story this week was developments regarding the Iowa First in the Nation caucuses, when the Democratic Party has basically said you have to apply if you want to be first. You're not guaranteed, and this is causing angst among Democrats. Some are happy with that decision. They're tired of going first. They don't like the caucuses, the process. But Erin, you wrote about this morning. It seemed that some Democrats were reluctant to talk about that decision, and it seemed like Republicans were much more willing to talk about the decision and the fact that they are going to go first again in 2024. Where's this going from here?
Yeah, it's going to be tough. And that, you're right, that was interesting. Like Iowa Democratic Party Chairman Russ Wilburn issued a statement to and not even just a blanket statement. Like if a reporter asked for a story, then they sent this statement. And I'm not aware of any interviews he's done, but I apologize if I missed that. They declined just sending the statement to me for my story. And then some past chair people declined to comment. I think that's maybe just more like, hey, that's the current chairman. I'm going to let him speak for the party. I shouldn't be piling on that right now. But yeah, so you had a situation where I'm trying to write a story about the Iowa Democratic Party's fight for the first in the nation, and the only live quotes I get are from the Republican Party, which is interesting. It's gonna be tough. So yes, they're turning it around, and everybody can apply. Any state can apply to be one of the first 4 or 5 states, but the criteria that they're talking about are going to make it hard for Iowa to break through that case. And I, he's stinking competitor, so I hate bringing up his name and keep giving him credit, but I guess he's a good guy, so I'll do it.
Get a daily update from the Gazette with our daily news podcast. Add it to your podcast player or your Alexa-friendly device to get a bite-sized local news update each day. Check it out at thegazette.com/podcasts.